United States v. Nixon was a key Supreme Court case in defining the extent of executive power. We will dive into the mind of the U.S. common man, explore the change in political systems, and how the United States culture shifted as a whole. United States v. Nixon defined the role of the presidency and increased the distrust people felt towards the executive branch. Richard Milhous Nixon was born on January 9, 1913 in Yorba Linda, California. He grew up in a Quaker family and had four brothers. Richard lived in poverty but was not disturbed by it because he never saw any other way of living. He earned a scholarship to Harvard but decided to stay at home and take care of his sick father, so he attended Whittier College. After a master's degree at Whittier, he went to grad school at Duke University School of Law. He had always wanted to join the FBI, but was turned down, so he joined the law firm Wingert and Bewley, and eventually opened his own branch. Richard got married in 1940 and had two daughters. The Nixon family eventually moved to Washington, D.C., and Nixon started working in federal government. He applied to the U.S. Navy and after a year climbed the ranks to lieutenant, which was very difficult to do in the first year of training.
After World War II ended, Nixon pursued a life in politics. He campaigned for a seat in the Senate for California in 1950 and won. He was known for supporting the Taft-Hartley Act and helped to pass the Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe after World War II. He also wanted to fight communism in Europe and did so by not letting countries fall into poverty. In 1952, Dwight Eisenhower was nominated by Republicans for the presidency and chose Nixon as his running mate. In mid-September, Nixon was found guilty of using campaign funds for personal use. This was not illegal, but it did lead voters to distrust him and almost took him off of the ticket. He regained the Republican vote by giving the Checkers speech, which was watched by 60 million Americans on TV and set a record for most views on one program. Nixon spoke about how he used the funds to take care of his dog, Checkers, and how he would never return the dog to return the funds he took from the campaign. Nixon gained public support and Eisenhower placed him on the ticket once again.
Nixon was a very involved vice president, attending cabinet and security meetings. He also traveled to improve foreign relations. In 1959, Nixon debated Khrushchev in the kitchen debate, which took place in a model kitchen over the systems of capitalism and communism. The people appreciated his courage and patriotism for arguing against such an important man, and also for defending the principle of American society.
The following year, Nixon started his campaign for the presidency with Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. as his running mate. Nixon opposed Democrat John F. Kennedy during the presidential debates. Kennedy's personality won the nation over and won him the election. These were the first televised presidential debates and had a significant effect on the voters. Voters now could hear and see the president on TV, and the personality of the nominee played a big role on how people voted. This is why Nixon spoke powerfully and appealed to the silent majority in his next election. Nixon would run for president again in 1968. He won the Republican nomination and then faced off against Hubert Humphrey, the current vice president. They were split over the Vietnam War, with Nixon backing the war and speaking out against counterculture. Nixon appealed to the silent majority, or the Conservative Party, against the hippies and anti-war protests. Nixon was the counterculture. Nixon was sworn into office on January 20th, 1969. He wanted to continue détente and become an international peacekeeper. Nixon started the movement to recognize Communist China, which was started with a ping-pong tournament. Nixon also improved relations with the Soviet Union with many meetings and talks of arm reductions, even though there were no significant breakthroughs. In the Middle East, Nixon actually fought communism with the Nixon Doctrine, which provided supplies and monetary assistance to countries vulnerable to communist takeover. The Nixon Doctrine was used during Yom Kippur, in which the U.S. supported Israel in a war against the Soviet allies in the Middle East.
Nixon started to promote peace with a policy called Vietnamization, which removed troops from Vietnam. Instead of troops, the U.S. would give money and supplies to South Vietnam to save U.S. lives. During this time, the Pentagon Papers, which detailed secret military actions, were leaked and showed the public the undercover actions of the executive branch. This was a strong point of criticism from Nixon's early years.
Another strong point of criticism involved the Vietnam War. Nixon approved the bombing of North Vietnamese bases and supply lines in Cambodia, a country that was not involved in the war. This was a violation of rules of warfare and drew strong criticism from the public. Nixon killed hundreds of men in Cambodia, including civilians. After the reports of these bombings were leaked to the public and Congress got word of it, there were huge reactions. Universities across the United States protested the bombings and the secrecy. During these protests, 4 students were shot and killed by police at Kent State, and other students were killed by police across the country. This increased hatred toward Nixon. Congress created the War Powers Act, which limited the extent to which a president can secretly control military operations. This previewed the extent Nixon would use executive power and how he acted secretly so he could get away with anything.
Nixon came into office with high taxes, a rising inflation, and a large budget deficit left from Lyndon B. Johnson. His main goal was to reduce inflation. He did this by trying to end the war in Vietnam to reduce federal spending. He also implemented a 90-day price and wage freeze to prevent inflation during that time period and hopefully slow it after the period stopped. He also proposed new federalism, which gave more money and more power to the states to reduce the size of the federal government. This way, the states could allocate resources to whichever programs necessary for the state and took power and resources away from the federal government. Nixon also made moves towards preserving the environment and putting environment over business. He supported restrictions on businesses to help the environment in almost every preservation and conservation law that was proposed. However, he did veto the Clean Water Act because it would cost the government too much money, and he didn't believe in the government spending in such large amounts. Congress overrode Nixon's veto and passed the bill anyway. Nixon then impounded the funds, which caused a rift between him and Congress.
A secret committee involving the executive branch ordered the wiretapping of the Watergate Hotel, where the Democratic National Convention was being held. 5 burglars broke in and bugged the building. They were caught and put on trial. Nixon downplayed the burglary as politics and called the press fake news. The press overplayed the scandal because they did not like Nixon and wanted to drive him out of office. During the trials, the investigations by the press exposed hush money paid to the burglars to not talk during the trial. This led to further investigation and the convictions of many officials in the executive branch that went down to protect Nixon. There is no solid evidence to connect Nixon to the bugging or any other illegal activity, but in the Oval Office there was a secret taping system that recorded many conversations.
Eventually, the investigation led to Nixon. Nixon started to get nervous and fired Archibald Cox, the lead investigator in the Saturday Night Massacre, after he subpoenaed the tape recordings from Nixon's office. Nixon claimed that he had the right to refuse the subpoenaed tapes because they contained classified information and he had executive privilege, but the investigators disagreed and said that the tapes were necessary to find a ruling on if Nixon and other executive officials were involved in Watergate. This led to the Supreme Court case United States v. Nixon. Leon Jaworski and Philip A. Lacovara argued the case for the U.S., while James D. St. Clair argued the case for President Nixon. The case was argued on July 8, 1974, and decided on July 24, 1974. Nixon argued that since the dispute was between the president and a special prosecutor, that the case shouldn't be subject to judicial review, but instead should be a dispute settled by the executive branch. Nixon also argued that the reach of executive privilege should be decided by the president, not the courts, and that if the courts were to decide that, then executive confidentiality justified his actions. In other words, the president was the one responsible for interpreting executive power to mean whatever they would like, and if the courts actually had this right, then the president could refuse because it contained classified information that could not be shared.
The U.S. government opposed this argument by saying that if the courts were to acknowledge this executive privilege, the need for evidence outweighs the privilege in this case. This was the first Supreme Court case that acknowledged that executive privilege actually exists. The court stated, neither the doctrine of separation of powers nor the generalized need for confidentiality of high-level communications without more can sustain an absolute unqualified presidential privilege of immunity from judicial process under all circumstances. The Supreme Court had to come up with a definition of executive power to prove how Nixon was overreaching his power. Berger had a history of protecting the rights of the common man and continued this pattern in U.S. v. Nixon. After more than a week of debate, the Supreme Court decision was fairly quick, a 9-0 decision saying Nixon did not have the right to withhold the tapes. Nixon resigned 16 days after the decision on August 9, 1974. Gerald Ford pardoned Nixon on September 8, 1974, 46 days after the Supreme Court decision. Watergate increased the belief and function of the separation of powers and a system of checks and balances in government. The U.S. system relied on shared power to prevent actions like those of Nixon. Supreme Court conducted the investigation and subpoenaed the tapes for Congress while Congress decided to impeach him. This showed the judicial and legislative branches keeping the executive branch in check. Watergate and Ford's pardon of Nixon caused a divide and loss of trust for the Republican Party and government as a whole. This led to the election of Jimmy Carter, a common man against politics and a Democrat. Later, during the Clinton presidency, the talks to impeach Clinton were come up with and made popular because of the recent attempt at impeachment of Nixon. Clinton was impeached over his affair with Monica Lewinsky. The affair was not grounds for impeachment, but because of the recent impeachment, it was a popular idea and eventually was carried out.
A more current effect of U.S. v. Nixon involves the law saying corporations have to make all donations to politicians and campaigns public to prevent hush money and bribes. The NRA now has to make all donations public, which shows bribe money for politicians to counter gun control laws and protect Second Amendment rights. The public has caught on to these donations and wants to replace these politicians with people who are more honest and willing to work to protect the lives of everyone in the U.S. Before Watergate had even occurred, studies published during Nixon's first term anticipated some of the main themes of Watergate. For example, the authors of 3 psychobiographies published in 1972 said Nixon had dangerous personality characteristics. This was first shown when Nixon stole campaign funds and then talked his way out of the consequences with the checker speech. People realized that no one is above the law. This case also restored faith in the justice system. After the case, people wanted to know what really happened, and investigative journalism increased. This led to more distrust in the government as well as a stronger belief in conspiracy theories. People thought the government had huge, elaborate plans to get away with anything. People wanted to take a more active role in government. Increased muckraking and investigative journalism, especially involving politics, arose. There was a rise in anti-politician groups, and there also was an increased support to elect the common man. Trump used this hate for politicians in his campaign to beat Hillary Clinton. In the current gun control movement, after so many school shootings, we can see how much the NRA has paid each politician, and how that has fueled the movement to elect clean politicians and people that will advocate for our lives, instead of the right to bear military rifles. People now associate each president with Nixon, which causes people to complain about the overuse of executive power. This has increased sectionalism between the two parties as well.
We can see many effects of this case in the criticism of the Obama administration. Republicans have complained about Obama's overreach of executive power and wanted him to suffer the consequences for these actions. People said Obama overreached his power with Obamacare, not enforcing immigration laws, creating taxes for those without health care, executive orders with the military action in the Middle East, raising minimum wage, and signing the Paris Accord. There were many Republicans speaking out against these actions as a violation of the systems of checks and balances, as Obama even admitted that he would try to get work done even if Congress does not agree to help. From the Nixon case, there are now specific limitations on the use of executive power, and presidents are at least supposed to be held to these limitations, even though many overreach them. The current president, Trump, has also overreached his power. His travel ban was put in place without the common process of being passed in Congress, and eventually Congress had to overrule his ban. Trump has also used his position as commander-in-chief to bomb terror groups in the Middle East without the approval of Congress and against the advice of his aides. He also fired James Comey, the head investigator in the case to see if Russia interfered in the election to help Trump get elected, just like Nixon fired the investigator in the Watergate investigation. Trump is also trying to build a wall between the U.S. and Mexico against the approval of Congress. Overall, U.S. v. Nixon played a key role in defining the role of the president. The case ensured that the president did not have too much power and kept a balance in the U.S. government. Because of U.S. v. Nixon, the following presidents have been restricted on their actions and critiqued by the public if they overused their power. The case not only had major political impacts, but also psychological and cultural ones as well. U.S. v. Nixon will go down as one of the most influential Supreme Court cases in U.S. history.